welcome back to The Mentors. This is Vadim.
And Sergey.
And you're listening to our weekly segment called the 5-Minute Pick-Me-Up, where we tell you stories to motivate you for the week to come.
And this week we've been thinking about something that is really a burden that weighs on a lot of entrepreneurs' minds, especially when they're first starting out, and that is their competition. The fact that you can see your competition doing better than you, again, especially in the beginning when you have very little. Even if you have some traction, there's probably a competitor out there that's doing better than you, that's further along than you, maybe has a better brand, raised more money, something else. And anytime you hear about them, you get that pit in your stomach feeling that makes you feel like, should I even exist, and why am I even doing this? And this is something that every entrepreneur faces. And I know if you're starting a company and you're listening to us right now, you probably felt this at some point in the last month, maybe even the last week. And we wanted to address that and really talk about why your competition is really not as important as you might think.
And by the way, there are some of you out there who might think that they don't have competition, or at the very least, they don't have anybody that's a direct competitor. But if you start working on your business, once you get into the weeds, once you start and continue to consume content that is related to the business and the company that you're starting, you will find a direct competitor sooner or later. There's almost no such thing as a completely unique new business idea.
One thing that's helpful, at least to me, when I'm going through this moment of crisis, I guess is one way to put it, is to think back of the different companies that I've worked at. In fact, a lot of entrepreneurs start businesses because they work for companies where they see so much room for improvement that they decide to do it on their own. And Vadim and I have a lot of stories of companies and startups that we worked for, very well-funded companies that have raised anywhere between $5 to $15 million, that had great founding teams and CEOs. But when you were on the inside, when you could see under the hood, things weren't as smooth as it looked in the outside world. And in fact, when we read oftentimes about some of the most high-flying companies, when they do end up burning out, oftentimes as it happens, as recently happened to WeWork, but many other companies as well, you start to see that things are not always as smooth on the inside. And what does that mean for an entrepreneur? That means it's an opportunity to make things better. It reminds me of a company that I used to work for that had a great founding team, that had $15 million in the bank, but every day we worked on that product, we could see all the problems with that product, and the reality is that users were not adopting it. And even though we were spinning a great narrative, people were not buying the product and spending the amount of money they needed to spend on the product in order for it to be sustainable. That business ended up failing. But in the moment, had I only paid attention to, let's say, what I would read about on the news if I was a competitor to that company, it would seem like things are going great. But in fact, on the inside, usually that's just not the case.
Which takes us to our next point, and that is what Sergey just mentioned, which is spinning a great narrative. The thing is, one of the hardest problems for any company to solve is how to drive interest consistently in a way that is cheaper than the money that you can make and the financial opportunity from the value that you're creating. And the companies that end up either raising a bunch of money or staying alive for at least 5 to 10 years are the ones that are able to have a solid marketing and sales engine. There's no way around it. Whether you're a bad company or you're a good company, you will not stay alive unless you have funding or unless you're able to get cash flow yourself. And what you find when you're out in the market is that there's businesses out there that have been able to create amazing marketing and amazing sales organizations, but what's failing under the hood is the actual product itself. Now, we don't want to minimize the difficulty of creating a successful marketing and sales engine, a successful revenue generating organization, but we do want to highlight the opportunity that this then creates. If you believe that you can build a better product, a product that looks more closely to the consumers and figures out how to match up value with that customer in a better way, that's an opportunity for you. And just because somebody else did a better job creating a marketing engine doesn't mean you shouldn't exist if you think you can bring more value to the world.
Absolutely. Of course, as Vadim said, you'll have to figure out the marketing at some point, or else you just won't survive long enough for people to get the benefit of your product. But that's where the excitement is. That's where the fact that you're just starting out gives you so much flexibility, and why really, really small baby startups that nobody has ever heard of, that may not even have any outside funding, are able to take customers away from incumbents, is because they can move very quickly. Now, you hear that, right? You read about that moving quickly, nimbleness, right, in a startup. What does that really mean? What that means is that any decision that you have on any day, in any moment of that day, you can implement immediately because there's no one telling you can't do it. You don't have necessarily a big team that will push back. You don't have investors that are telling you can't do something. You don't have thousands of customers that are driving you in a certain direction. You can literally change at any point in time, and that is actually an immense amount of freedom. In that regard, you can look at your competition and say, wait a minute, here's something that they're missing, and I can go full force and make it that much better.
And that is ultimately what comes down to finding and identifying an opportunity that you can capitalize on. It's not necessarily doing something so different that's never been done before in the world. It's doing something better, and maybe doing something that's just differentiated enough to justify your existence.
We've seen it time and time again in history. When Richard Branson started his first record shop that ended up turning into a recording studios and record stores were not anything new in the 70s when they first started. When Steve Jobs started computers, he was not the first one to make computers. When Google started their search engine, they weren't the first, they weren't even the third or fourth. I did a project in middle school about search engines, and I think there was 5 or 6 other ones in my science project that beat out Google because it wasn't yet the big player in the world.
Well, we said that Metacrawler and Ask Jeeves were better than Google. I think that was the wrong.
Well, I think the hypotheses with which I did my testing for that experiment were incorrect. But the point still stands. Google seemed to come out of nowhere, and in fact, Larry and Sergey were just working in Stanford on this graduate project, and they were on their way to a great academic career that they didn't actually want to leave. They tried to sell it for $1 million, I think, to a competitor. That didn't end up working out. So they weren't even sure that their product should exist. They cared about competition. They cared about the fact that starting a company was really hard and they didn't know if it was going to work. But ultimately, their product was that much better, and they were able to use their competitors to see what they were missing and make their product 100 times better. So in the moment, it's easy to get discouraged by your competitors, especially when it looks like they might be so big or when they might be doing so well, even if those competitors are startups. But realize that it actually gives you an opportunity. And if you focus too much on why they're better than you might actually be missing the opportunity.
Now, we're not saying you shouldn't care about your competition at all. It is smart to be aware of them, and it is smart to do your research and competitive analysis to understand where you might find opportunities. But what we are saying is don't worry about your competition at the expense of getting started. Because if you truly care about your product, if you care about the customers that you are serving, there's a very good chance you might be able to build even more value than your competitors are able to build right now.
Thank you for listening to this episode. It was inspired by the fact that, in online education, Vadim and I are seeing a lot of different competition out there, both universities and colleges that are starting to move online right now, and they've been around for a very long time, and also new startups that are doing great things in online education and remote learning. And it's easy sometimes to get discouraged when you see competition, but Vadim and I are already able to see things that those companies are missing. In fact, we're talking to some of their customers, and their customers are telling us what's wrong with those competitors' products and services, and it always gets us inspired when we focus on the opportunity when we're working on our own business, School 16, and hopefully this episode can inspire you to do the same. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.